Timid cook greeted the deaf mother of the pilot Millionaire. His sign language left everyone shocked. A true story of compassion, secrets, and unexpected connections. As told by Marcus Chen, personal secretary to the Goldstein family. I've served the Goldstein family for nearly 15 years, and in that time I thought I'd seen everything. I'd witnessed business deals worth hundreds of millions, watched empires rise and fall, observed the intricate dance of Manhattan's elite society. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what unfolded that cool September evening, when a shy young cook from a modest restaurant in Greenwich Village became the unlikely bridge between a desperate mother and the truth that had been suffocating our household for months. My name is Marcus Chen, and this is the story I've kept locked away until now. The story of how Sarah Mitchell, a 26-year-old line cook with flour-dusted aprons and calloused hands, walked into the gilded cage of the Goldstein mansion and shattered everything we thought we knew about the family I'd devoted my life to serving. The Goldstein Empire. Let me paint you a picture of the world Sarah stepped into that fateful autumn. The Goldstein residence stands on Fifth Avenue overlooking Central Park, a limestone monument to generational wealth that stretches 5 stories into the Manhattan skyline. Every marble floor, every crystal chandelier, every priceless painting whispered the same message: power, prestige, permanence. This was the domain of Benjamin Goldstein, the real estate magnate whose name appeared in Forbes every year, whose handshake could make or break entire neighborhoods, whose reputation for shrewd business dealings was matched only by his reputation for philanthropy. Benjamin was in his late 60s when our story begins. A man of distinguished bearing with silver hair and penetrating gray eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they observed. He'd built his empire from almost nothing, the grandson of immigrants who'd arrived at Ellis Island with little more than hope and determination. Now he controlled property portfolios spanning 3 continents, employed thousands, and moved through society with the confidence of someone who'd earned every penny through intelligence, timing, and an almost supernatural ability to read people. His son, David Goldstein, was the crown prince of this empire, and the source of both immense pride and unspoken tension within the household. David was 34 years old, Harvard-educated, and had recently achieved something his father never could. He'd become a licensed commercial airline pilot. While Benjamin had conquered the earth, buying and selling the ground beneath people's feet, David had chosen the sky. It was a romantic rebellion in its way, a billionaire's son rejecting the boardroom for the cockpit, trading power lunches for flight plans. He flew for a boutique private aviation company that catered to the ultra-wealthy, piloting Gulfstreams and Bombardiers to exotic destinations. His clients included celebrities, politicians, and fellow titans of industry. He was handsome in that effortless way that comes from good genes and better personal trainers, with his mother's warm brown eyes and his father's strong jawline. Tabloids loved him. Socialites pursued him. His parents worried about him. And then there was Ruth Goldstein, David's mother and Benjamin's wife of 38 years. Ruth was the emotional center of the family, the softness that balanced Benjamin's hardness, the warmth that offset his calculating coldness. She'd been born deaf, the result of complications during her own birth, but she'd never let it define or limit her. She'd learned to read lips with extraordinary precision, mastered American Sign Language, and navigated the hearing world with a grace that made most people forget she couldn't hear at all. She was beautiful in her early 60s, with expressive eyes that compensated for the voice she rarely used and hands that spoke volumes. Her charity work was legendary. She'd founded 3 schools for deaf children, served on countless boards, and used her position to advocate tirelessly for accessibility and inclusion. But something had changed in Ruth over the past 6 months. I'd noticed it first, the way her eyes would cloud with worry, the trembling in her usually steady hands, the way she'd pause outside David's bedroom door late at night, her face etched with an anguish that had nothing to do with sound. She was witnessing something that terrified her, something she couldn't quite articulate, and her inability to communicate what she knew was slowly destroying her from the inside. The dinner that changed everything. It was a Thursday evening in mid-September, when the universe conspired to bring Sarah Mitchell into our world. The Goldsteins were hosting a small dinner party. 12 guests, all important to Benjamin's latest development project in the Hudson Yards area. I'd arranged everything with my usual precision. The caterer from that exclusive French restaurant on the Upper East Side, the wine from Benjamin's private collection, The floral arrangements that cost more than most people's monthly rent. But at 4 o'clock that afternoon, I received a call that sent my carefully constructed plans into chaos. "Mr. Chen?" The voice belonged to Philippe, the head chef at Maison Bouchard. "I'm calling with terrible news. My entire kitchen staff has come down with food poisoning. We cannot fulfill your order this evening." My stomach dropped. "Philippe, this is unacceptable." "Mr. Goldstein has 12 guests arriving in 4 hours. I understand, and I am devastated, but I cannot send 6 staff to prepare food. It would be a health violation and potentially disastrous. However, I may have a solution." He told me about a small restaurant in Greenwich Village called the Copper Spoon. Modest, unpretentious, but known among food enthusiasts for exceptional American comfort food with subtle international influences. The owner had trained at the Culinary Institute of America and ran a tight kitchen with a small, dedicated staff. "They're not fancy like us," Philippe admitted. "But the chef there, Sarah Mitchell, she's extraordinarily talented. And more importantly, she's available." I had no choice. I called the Copper Spoon, spoke with the owner, negotiated an emergency rate that would have paid for a used car, and arranged for them to send their best cook with everything needed to prepare dinner for 12. At 5:30, Sarah Mitchell arrived at the service entrance with 2 assistants and enough ingredients to feed a small army. I remember opening the door and seeing her for the first time. Average height, slender but strong, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and not a trace of makeup on her freckled face. She wore chef's whites that had seen better days, carried a knife roll that was worn but obviously well maintained, and had the most striking green eyes I'd ever seen. Intelligent, observant, and deeply kind. "Mr. Chen?" she asked, her voice soft and slightly uncertain. "I'm Sarah Mitchell from the Copper Spoon. Where would you like us to set up?" There was something immediately appealing about her, a genuine quality that felt refreshing in a world where everyone seemed to be performing, calculating, positioning themselves for advantage. She didn't gawk at the mansion's opulence or try to make conversation beyond what was necessary. She simply rolled up her sleeves and got to work. I showed them to the kitchen, a commercial-grade space that rivaled many restaurant kitchens, and left them to their preparations. I had other matters to attend to: the table settings, the guest list verification, ensuring Benjamin's study was prepared for the inevitable post-dinner discussions of business. But throughout the evening I found myself drawn back to the kitchen, ostensibly to check on progress, but really because there was something fascinating about watching Sarah work. She moved through the space like a dancer, economical and graceful, her hands creating art from ingredients with a focus that seemed almost meditative. She wasn't just cooking, she was crafting an experience. And she did it all with a quiet confidence that suggested she was more comfortable expressing herself through food than through words. The unexpected encounter dinner was served at 8 o'clock sharp, and it was, by all accounts, magnificent. The guests raved about every course: the roasted butternut squash soup with sage oil, the herb-crusted rack of lamb with pomegranate glaze, the individual chocolate soufflés that emerged from the oven at precisely the right moment. Even Benjamin, who rarely commented on food beyond adequate or subpar, nodded his approval and asked me to ensure the restaurant received appropriate compensation and praise. I was in the kitchen around 9:30, discussing final cleanup with Sarah's team, when Ruth Goldstein wandered in. This was unusual. Ruth rarely ventured into the kitchen during events, preferring to remain with the guests, using her remarkable lip-reading abilities to follow conversations. But there she was, elegant in a sapphire blue dress that matched her jewelry, her expression troubled and distant. She didn't notice us at first. She moved to the window that overlooked the back garden, her arms wrapped around herself in a gesture of self-comfort that made my heart ache. I'd seen her do this more and more lately, drift away from conversations, retreat into private spaces, her face shadowed with an anxiety that seemed to grow stronger each day. Sarah noticed her immediately. I watched as the young cook's eyes softened with concern, taking in Ruth's body language with the kind of attention most people reserve for reading recipes. Then Sarah did something that changed everything. She moved quietly toward Ruth, careful not to startle her, and gently tapped her own chest before signing a simple question in American Sign Language. "Are you okay?" Ruth turned, surprise flashing across her face. Her eyes widened as she realized what Sarah had just done, and her hands moved instinctively to respond. "You sign?" Sarah nodded, her expression warm and open. "Yes." She signed back. My younger brother is deaf. I've been signing since I was 8 years old. I stood frozen, watching this exchange unfold. In all my years with the family, I'd rarely seen anyone outside their immediate circle communicate with Ruth in her native language. Most people relied on her lip-reading abilities, speaking slowly and clearly, treating her as someone to be accommodated rather than truly understood. But Sarah was different. She signed with the fluency of someone for whom ASL was a second language, her movements natural and unself-conscious. Ruth's entire demeanor shifted. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, and something that looked like relief, or perhaps hope, flickered across her face. I didn't expect to find anyone here who could understand me, she signed. Language is universal when we need it to be. Sarah signed back, a gentle smile playing at her lips. Sometimes the heart speaks louder than words. They stood there for a moment, two women from completely different worlds connected by this unexpected bridge of understanding. And then Ruth's eyes filled with tears. Can you stay? Ruth signed, urgency making her movements sharp and desperate. After your work is done, I need to tell someone something I can't say to my family, something I see every night that's breaking my heart. Sarah glanced at me, questioning, and I found myself nodding before I'd fully processed what I was agreeing to. There was something in Ruth's face that transcended protocol and propriety, a mother's desperation that demanded response. Of course, Sarah signed. I'll stay as long as you need me. The secret revealed it was nearly midnight when Ruth finally felt ready to share what had been tormenting her. The dinner guests had departed. Benjamin had retired to his study for late-night phone calls with associates in different time zones, and David had texted to say he wouldn't be home until late, something about a late-night flight from Teterboro Airport. The household staff had been dismissed, and the mansion had settled into that peculiar quiet that large houses achieve late at night. Not silence exactly, but a hushed quality that makes confidences feel both necessary and possible. Ruth led Sarah and me to the family's private sitting room on the 3rd floor, a comfortable space far from the formal rooms where business was conducted and appearances were maintained. She sat on the sofa, her hands trembling slightly as she began to sign. Sarah sat across from her, leaning forward with complete attention, and I positioned myself nearby, feeling both like an intruder and a necessary witness to whatever was about to unfold. My son, Ruth signed, her movements slow and deliberate, weighted with emotion. My beautiful, successful son. Everyone thinks they know him. They see the pilot, the millionaire's heir, the handsome bachelor. They see confidence and privilege and possibility. She paused, closing her eyes briefly before continuing. But I see something different. Every night I see the truth he hides from everyone, including himself. Sarah remained still, giving Ruth space to continue at her own pace. David's bedroom is next to mine, Ruth signed. Our rooms share a wall and there's a connecting door that we haven't locked since he was a child. I'm deaf, but I'm not blind. And late at night, when he thinks everyone is asleep, I see things that terrify me. My pulse quickened. What could Ruth have witnessed that had caused her such distress? Every night after midnight, he comes home from wherever he's been. I feel, the vibration of his footsteps on the floor, and I watch him through the crack in the connecting door. Ruth's hands moved faster now, agitation making her signs less precise. He stands in front of his mirror for hours, not minutes, hours, and he cries. Sarah's eyebrows drew together in concern, but she didn't interrupt. He looks at himself in the mirror, and I can see that he doesn't recognize the person looking back at him. He touches his face like he's searching for someone else. Sometimes he mouths words I can't understand. Sometimes he just stares, tears streaming down his face, his whole body shaking with silent sobs that I can feel through the floor. Ruth's own tears began to fall, and Sarah reached out instinctively, taking the older woman's hands in hers, a gesture of comfort that transcended language. I don't know what's wrong, Ruth signed when she'd composed herself enough to continue. I don't know if he's depressed, if he's struggling with his identity, if he's in pain I can't understand. But I see my son drowning and I can't reach him. I try to talk to him during the day, but he smiles and tells me everything is fine. He performs being happy so convincingly that even his father believes it. She looked directly at Sarah, her eyes pleading. But mothers know. We see past the performances. And I'm watching my son disappear into himself night after night, and I don't know how to save him. The room felt heavy with the weight of this confession. I'd had no idea Ruth had been carrying this burden, watching helplessly as her son struggled with demons none of us could see. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally signed, her movements were gentle and careful. "Have you tried to talk to him about what you've seen?" Ruth nodded vigorously. "I've tried. But how do I tell him I've been watching him in his private moments? How do I admit that I've witnessed his most vulnerable states without his knowledge? He would feel violated, exposed. And he's so skilled at deflecting, at reassuring, at making me doubt what I've seen with my own eyes." "What about speaking with his father?" Sarah signed. Ruth's expression turned bitter. "Benjamin loves David, but he doesn't understand him. He sees weakness as something to be overcome through willpower and discipline. If I tell him David is crying alone in his room every night, he'll view it as a problem to be solved through therapy appointments and perhaps medication, treating symptoms without understanding the disease." Sarah nodded slowly, processing this information. Then she signed something that surprised both Ruth and me. What if the crying isn't the problem? What if it's the solution? Ruth looked confused, so Sarah continued. "Sometimes tears aren't a sign of breaking down. Sometimes they're a sign of breaking through. Maybe David is processing something, grieving something, or finally allowing himself to feel things he's suppressed for years. The mirror work, looking at himself, questioning who he sees, that's not necessarily destructive. It could be the beginning of self-discovery." I watched Ruth's face as she absorbed this perspective, seeing the subtle shift in her expression as fear began to mix with something else, perhaps understanding, or at least the possibility of it. "But how do I help him?" Ruth signed, her movements small and desperate. "How do I let him know I see him, that I love him, that whatever he's going through, he doesn't have to face it alone?" Sarah thought for a moment before responding. "You create space for truth, not by confronting him with what you've witnessed, but by letting him know, through your actions, your presence, your unconditional acceptance, that whatever he needs to tell you, whenever he's ready, you'll listen without judgment." She paused, then added, "And perhaps if you're comfortable with it, you could leave your connecting door open, not to spy, but to offer silent companionship. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone who's struggling is simply the knowledge that they're not alone, even in their darkest moments." The conversation that followed, what happened next, was extraordinary. For the next 3 hours, Ruth, Sarah, and I sat in that sitting room, and Ruth poured out months of accumulated worry, fear, and helplessness. Sarah listened with remarkable patience, asking thoughtful questions, offering gentle insights, never pretending to have easy answers, but providing something perhaps more valuable, genuine understanding and compassionate witness to a mother's pain. Ruth talked about David's childhood, his sensitivity as a boy, the way he'd always seemed slightly out of step with the aggressive, competitive world his father inhabited. She talked about his decision to become a pilot, which she'd seen as both an escape and a search, leaving the ground where his father's empire existed, seeking something purer in the sky. She talked about her own struggles as a deaf woman in a hearing world, the isolation that came with being perpetually on the outside of easy communication, even within her own family. She talked about the fear that her disability had somehow contributed to David's struggles, that perhaps if she'd been able to hear his childhood confessions, late-night worries, the subtle shifts in his voice that might have signaled distress, she could have intervened earlier, helped more effectively. Sarah challenged this gently, signing with conviction. "Your deafness isn't a limitation. It's given you different ways of seeing. You've witnessed David's pain precisely because you've been watching instead of just listening. Hearing people often miss what's right in front of them because they're distracted by words. You see the truth beneath the performance." As dawn began to lighten the sky outside, Ruth seemed lighter somehow, as if the simple act of sharing her burden had eased its weight. She looked at Sarah with something like wonder. "How did you become so wise?" she signed. "You're so young." Sarah smiled, a touch of sadness in her expression. "Pain teaches us wisdom if we let it. My brother, the one I mentioned, he struggled terribly when we were teenagers. He felt isolated in ways I couldn't fully understand, trapped between the deaf world and the hearing world, never quite belonging to either. He tried to take his own life when he was 16. Ruth gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "He survived," Sarah signed quickly, "and he's doing much better now. But that experience taught me something important. People who are struggling don't need us to fix them or save them. They need us to witness them, to hold space for their pain without trying to take it away." Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply sit with someone in their darkness and remind them they're not alone. I found myself unexpectedly moved by this young woman's depth of understanding, her hard-won wisdom that seemed disproportionate to her years. Ruth signed a question that had clearly been building throughout the conversation. Would you be willing to come back? Not as a cook, but as, I don't know what to call it, a friend, a translator, someone who understands both worlds, the hearing and the deaf, the privileged and the struggling, the performance and the reality. Sarah hesitated, and I could see her weighing the request carefully. Mrs. Goldstein, I'm honored by your trust, but I'm not a therapist or a counselor. I'm just a cook from Greenwich Village who happens to know sign language. Sometimes, Ruth signed with conviction, that's exactly what someone needs. Not an expert with degrees and clinical detachment, but a human being with empathy and honest wisdom. Please, at least think about it. Sarah looked at me, perhaps seeking guidance about the appropriateness of such an arrangement. I found myself nodding slowly. The protocols and proprieties that normally governed my decisions seemed less important than the genuine connection I'd witnessed between these two women. I'll think about it, Sarah signed to Ruth, and I'll stay in touch. You have my number now through Mr. Chen. If you need to talk, if you see something that frightens you or you simply need someone to listen, please reach out. Anytime. Ruth embraced Sarah then, holding her tightly, and I saw fresh tears streaming down both women's faces. Not tears of sadness this time, but of relief and gratitude, and the peculiar joy that comes from being truly understood. The weeks that followed, true to her word, Sarah stayed in touch with Ruth. Initially, they communicated through text messages, which Ruth typed with remarkable speed. Then they began video calling, using the technology that allows deaf individuals to see sign language clearly across digital distances. And gradually, Sarah began visiting the house once or twice a week, always in the evening after her shift at the Copper Spoon ended, always welcomed warmly by Ruth and tactfully accommodated by me. I watched their friendship deepen with something like amazement. Ruth seemed to come alive in Sarah's presence, laughing more freely, signing with more animation, rediscovering a joy that had been dimmed by months of secret worry. And Sarah, for her part, seemed to find something valuable in these visits, perhaps the opportunity to use her skills in service of genuine human connection, rather than just professional obligation. But David remained unaware of these developments. His schedule kept him traveling frequently, flights to Los Angeles, Miami, the Caribbean, anywhere wealthy clients needed to go. And when he was home, he maintained the polished, successful facade that had fooled everyone except his mother. Ruth continued her nightly vigils, watching through the connecting door as David conducted his solitary rituals of tears and mirror gazing. But following Sarah's advice, she left her door slightly more open, and sometimes she would sit where David could see her if he looked, not intruding, just present, offering silent companionship to his lonely struggle. And then, approximately 6 weeks after Sarah's first visit, something shifted. The breakthrough. It was a Friday night in late October, and Sarah was visiting as she'd begun to do regularly. She and Ruth were in the sitting room discussing a new recipe Sarah was developing. Something about brown butter and sage that required Ruth's input since she'd traveled extensively in Italy and understood authentic Italian flavors. I was downstairs in my small office off the kitchen reviewing Benjamin's schedule for the following week when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, uneven, the kind of footfalls that suggest emotional weight as much as physical movement. David appeared in the kitchen doorway. I'd seen him earlier that evening when he'd arrived home, and he'd looked fine, tired from a long day of flying, but otherwise his normal self. Now, however, he looked devastated. His eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, his normally immaculate appearance disheveled, and his hands were shaking slightly. "Marcus," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "is my mother home?" "She's upstairs in the sitting room," I replied carefully. "With a guest." "A guest?" He looked surprised. "At this hour?" "A friend," I said. "Sarah Mitchell. She's been visiting regularly." David frowned, clearly confused. His mother didn't typically have visitors at night, especially not people he'd never heard of. "I need to talk to her. It's important." I hesitated, uncertain about interrupting the women upstairs, but David's expression convinced me this couldn't wait. "Let me let her know you're here." I climbed the stairs quickly, knocked gently on the sitting room door, and poked my head in. Ruth and Sarah were laughing about something, their hands moving in animated conversation, and I felt momentarily guilty for intruding on their happiness. "Mrs. Goldstein," I said, waiting for Ruth to look at me so she could read my lips. "David is home, and he's asking to see you. He seems distressed." Ruth's expression shifted immediately from joy to concern. She looked at Sarah, signing quickly. "I should go to him." Sarah nodded. "Of course, I'll leave." But Ruth caught her hand, signing emphatically. "No, please stay. I might need you. If he's finally ready to talk, I might need someone who can help me understand, help me respond with wisdom instead of just maternal panic." Sarah looked uncertain, but Ruth's pleading expression convinced her. "All right, but I'll stay out of the way unless you need me." We all made our way downstairs, where David was pacing in the kitchen, his agitation evident in every movement. When he saw his mother, his carefully constructed composure crumbled completely. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking on the word, "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending. I can't keep performing this version of myself that everyone expects. I'm drowning, and I don't know how to ask for help." Ruth's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. She moved toward her son, but then stopped, perhaps uncertain how to bridge the gap between them after months of unspoken distance. David looked at me, then at Sarah, confusion evident on his face. "Who are you?" he asked, not rudely but with the bewilderment of someone so deep in their own crisis that social niceties had temporarily ceased to matter. Sarah started to respond verbally, but Ruth intercepted, her hands moving in signs that David had grown up understanding even if he didn't use them regularly himself. "This is Sarah. She's my friend. She understands what it means to struggle. And more importantly, she understands what it means to be deaf in a hearing world, to feel like you're always on the outside of easy communication, always having to translate yourself for others' understanding." David looked at Sarah with new interest, then back at his mother. "You've been talking to her about me?" Ruth nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I've been watching you, David. Every night I see you through our connecting door. I see you crying in front of your mirror, searching for something in your reflection, and I've been terrified because I didn't know how to help you." David's face went through a rapid series of expressions: shock, embarrassment, anger, and finally relief. "You've been watching me? All this time, you knew?" "I knew you were suffering," Ruth signed. "I didn't know why, but I knew that the sun I saw every day was different from the sun I saw every night, and my heart was breaking for both of them." There was a long moment of silence, or rather, the kind of charged quiet that precedes either conflict or breakthrough. Then David did something unexpected. He looked directly at Sarah and asked, "Can you translate for me? I can sign, but I'm not fluent, and I need my mother to understand exactly what I'm saying." Sarah nodded, positioning herself where both David and Ruth could see her clearly, and David began to talk. David's truth. "Mom," David said, his voice steadier now that he'd committed to honesty. "I've been lying to everyone for so long that I'd almost started believing the lies myself. But you're right. The man you see during the day isn't the real me. He's a performance, a character I've been playing because I thought it was what everyone needed me to be." Sarah signed his words simultaneously, her movements capturing not just the content but the emotion behind them. "I became a pilot because I thought if I could get far enough away from everything, from Dad's expectations, from the family business, from the person everyone assumed I was, I could figure out who I actually wanted to be. And for a while it worked. Up in the air, alone in the cockpit, I felt free. I felt like maybe I could become someone authentic." He paused, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "But you can't outrun yourself. Eventually you have to land. And every time I landed, I had to put the mask back on. Successful David, confident David, the son who has everything figured out. And the distance between who I was pretending to be and who I actually was kept growing until I felt like I was disappearing." Ruth was crying openly now, but she remained focused on Sarah's signs, absorbing every word. "The mirror thing," David continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "That's me trying to find myself, trying to see past the performance to whatever's real underneath. And most nights I can't. I look in the mirror and I see a stranger. Someone who's lost themselves so completely in trying to please everyone else that there's nothing authentic left." He looked directly at his mother then, speaking more slowly so she could read his lips even as Sarah continued to sign. "I'm not the son you think I am, Mom. I'm not the son Dad thinks I am. I'm not even sure who I actually am anymore. But I know I can't keep living this way. Something has to change, or I'm going to break completely." Ruth moved toward her son then, closing the distance between them with determined steps. She cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her, and began to sign with fierce conviction. "Listen to me, David Goldstein," Sarah translated, her voice carrying Ruth's maternal intensity. "You are my son, not the performance, not the mask, not the successful pilot or the millionaire's heir. You, the person underneath all of that, whoever that person is, you are my son, and I love you with a fierceness that has nothing to do with your accomplishments or your ability to meet anyone's expectations." David's face crumpled, and Ruth pulled him into an embrace. "You say you don't know who you are?" Ruth continued through Sarah's voice. "But I know who you are. You're the little boy who cried when we had to trim the tree in our backyard because you were worried about the birds' nests. You're the teenager who learned sign language so I wouldn't feel isolated at your school events. You're the young man who became a pilot not because it was practical, but because you've always been drawn to beauty and freedom and possibility." She held him at arm's length, her signs emphatic and clear. "Who you are has nothing to do with what you do or what you achieve. Who you are is kind and sensitive and thoughtful and brave enough to admit when you're struggling. That's my son. That's who I see. And that's who I've always loved." David sobbed then, great heaving cries that seemed to come from somewhere deep and long suppressed. Ruth held him, rocking him slightly the way mothers do regardless of their children's age. And Sarah and I stood witness to this moment of raw honesty and unconditional love. When David finally calmed enough to speak again, he looked at Sarah with red-rimmed eyes. "You helped her understand all this?" Sarah shook her head gently. "I didn't help her understand anything. Your mother has always understood. She just needed someone to confirm that what she was seeing was real, and to give her perspective on how to reach you. Mothers always know, David. They just don't always know what to do with what they know." David smiled weakly. "You're very wise for a cook from Greenwich Village." "I prefer experienced," Sarah replied with a small smile. "Wisdom sounds too much like I have answers. I don't have answers. I just have empathy and a really good understanding of what it feels like to watch someone you love struggle with identity and belonging." The conversation with Benjamin. The next challenge came 2 days later when Ruth insisted that Benjamin needed to know what was happening with David. Benjamin had been in Washington, D.C., for meetings during David's breakthrough, and Ruth had been dreading his return. She knew her husband loved their son, but she also knew Benjamin's approach to problems tended toward the tactical rather than the emotional. She asked Sarah to be present for the conversation, and Sarah agreed, though I could see her nervousness about inserting herself into such intimate family dynamics. We gathered in Benjamin's study on Sunday afternoon, Benjamin behind his massive desk, Ruth and David on the sofa, Sarah and I standing somewhat awkwardly near the door, unsure of our exact role in this family drama. Benjamin listened to David's explanation with his characteristic focused attention, his expression giving away nothing. When David finished, there was a long silence that Ruth later told me felt like it lasted hours. Then Benjamin spoke, his voice measured and controlled. "I see. So you're telling me you've been having some sort of identity crisis, and instead of coming to me, your father, someone who's dealt with pressure and expectations his entire life, you've been consulting with the family cook's new friend?" The disdain in his voice was unmistakable, and I saw David flinch. But Ruth stood up, her face flushed with anger, and began signing with sharp, aggressive movements that needed no translation to convey her fury. Sarah translated anyway, her voice steady. "How dare you diminish what David is going through by calling it some sort of identity crisis? Our son has been suffering, Benjamin. He's been drowning in expectations, your expectations, society's expectations, his own impossible standards, and he's been doing it alone because he was afraid of exactly this response." Benjamin's eyes widened slightly. He wasn't accustomed to Ruth challenging him so directly. Ruth continued, her signs becoming even more emphatic. "And Sarah isn't the family cook's new friend. She's someone who has wisdom you and I lack. Someone who understands what it means to feel like you don't belong in the world you're supposed to inhabit. She's helped me understand our son better than I have in years. And she's helped David feel safe enough to finally tell us the truth." She moved closer to Benjamin's desk, her hands moving with deliberate precision. "You built an empire, Benjamin. You're brilliant at reading markets and people and opportunities, but you're terrible at reading vulnerability. You see it as weakness to be overcome rather than truth to be honored. And if you respond to our son's honesty with judgment or tactical problem-solving, you'll lose him. Not physically, perhaps, but emotionally. He'll retreat back into his performance and you'll never see the real David again. Benjamin looked at his wife with something that might have been surprise or respect or perhaps both. In all my years with the family, I'd rarely seen Ruth so fierce, so unapologetically emotional. He turned his attention to Sarah then, studying her with the same intensity he usually reserved for business adversaries. "You've had quite an impact on my family in a very short time, Miss Mitchell." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I haven't done anything except listen, Mr. Goldstein. Sometimes that's the most powerful thing we can do. Simply listen without judgment, without trying to fix or solve or redirect. Just witness someone's truth and honor it." "And what do you think my son needs?" Benjamin asked, his tone still somewhat challenging. "I think," Sarah said carefully, "that David needs permission to figure out who he is without the pressure of who he's supposed to be. He needs time to explore his authentic self, his real interests, values, and desires without feeling like every choice is tentar novamente t, continuar, a referendum on his worth, or a rejection of your legacy." She paused, then added with quiet conviction, "And I think he needs to know that his father loves him not for what he achieves or how well he performs, but simply because he's your son. Unconditional love isn't just a phrase, Mr. Goldstein, it's a practice. And it requires us to release our expectations and embrace the person who actually exists, rather than the person we imagined." Benjamin was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled in front of his face in that characteristic pose he adopted when thinking deeply. Finally, he looked at David. "I built everything I have through discipline and strategic thinking," he said slowly. "I believed that if I taught you those same principles, you'd be equipped to handle anything life threw at you. I thought I was giving you tools for success." He stood up, walking around the desk to stand in front of his son. "But I see now that I may have given you a blueprint for a life that isn't yours to live. And for that, David, I apologize." David's eyes widened in shock. In all his years, he'd perhaps never heard his father apologize for anything. "I don't fully understand what you're going through," Benjamin continued. "My challenges were different. Poverty, discrimination, the struggle to be taken seriously in a world that dismissed people like me. But I understand feeling trapped. I understand the weight of expectations. And I understand that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you need help." He reached out somewhat awkwardly and pulled David into an embrace. Stiff and unpracticed, but genuine. "You're my son. That's not conditional on your career choices or your ability to take over my business or anything else. You're my son, and I love you. And if you need time to figure things out, we'll figure out how to make that happen." Ruth was crying again, and even I felt my throat tighten with emotion. Sarah remained quiet, her presence somehow both unobtrusive and essential, a witness to this family's moment of breakthrough. The plan forward. Over the following weeks, a plan emerged. David decided to take a sabbatical from flying, not permanently abandoning his career, but giving himself space to explore what he actually wanted rather than what he thought he should want. Benjamin arranged for him to meet with a therapist who specialized in identity issues and family dynamics, someone who came highly recommended and, importantly, who had no connection to the Goldstein family or their social circle. Ruth continued her friendship with Sarah, which had evolved into something genuine and reciprocal. Sarah brought a groundedness to Ruth's world that was refreshingly free from pretense or social calculation, and Ruth provided Sarah with a maternal warmth and acceptance that I later learned Sarah's own mother had never quite managed to offer. And surprisingly, David and Sarah developed their own connection. She became something like a translator between worlds for him, someone who could help him articulate feelings he'd long suppressed, who could remind him that authenticity was more valuable than performance, who could simply sit with him in his uncertainty without trying to rush him toward resolution. I watched all of this unfold with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. In 15 years of serving the Goldstein family, I'd witnessed countless business triumphs, social victories, and material acquisitions. But I'd never seen anything quite like this. The quiet revolution that occurred when one timid cook with flour-dusted aprons and a knowledge of sign language walked into their world and helped them remember how to truly see each other. Sarah's impact. What struck me most profoundly about Sarah wasn't just her wisdom or empathy, though both were remarkable. It was her complete lack of self-importance. She never positioned herself as a savior or expert. She never tried to insert herself into family decisions or claim credit for the transformations occurring around her. She simply showed up consistently, listened deeply, and offered perspective when asked. She maintained her job at the Copper Spoon, continued her modest life in Greenwich Village, and treated her connection to the Goldstein family as a friendship rather than an opportunity. I asked her once during one of her visits when I was preparing tea while she waited for Ruth, why she'd chosen to stay involved with a family so far outside her normal world. She smiled, that gentle expression I'd come to recognize as her thinking face. "My brother," she said softly, "the one I told Ruth about. He's thriving now. He has friends in the deaf community. He's confident in his identity. He's building a life that feels authentic to him. But there was a time when I thought we'd lose him, when his pain was so profound, and his isolation so complete that I was terrified every time my phone rang, convinced it would be the call telling me he was gone." She paused, stirring honey into her tea with careful attention. Ruth reminded me of myself during that time, watching someone she loved suffer, desperate to help but unsure how. And David reminded me of my brother, trapped in a performance of normalcy, drowning in expectations, unable to articulate what he needed because he didn't even know himself. She looked up at me then, her green eyes serious. If I can help prevent one family from experiencing that kind of loss, or even just help them understand each other a little better, why wouldn't I? We're all just walking each other home, Marcus. That's all any of us can do. Show up for each other when it matters and offer whatever light we can carry. Her words stayed with me, a reminder that profound impact doesn't always come from grand gestures or professional expertise. Sometimes it comes from simple human kindness, offered consistently and without expectation of return. Months later, the transformation. I'm writing this account now, nearly 8 months after Sarah first walked into the Goldstein mansion carrying her knife roll and her quiet competence. So much has changed. David is still on his sabbatical, though sabbatical perhaps isn't the right word anymore. He's exploring different aspects of himself. He's been taking painting classes, volunteering with a youth mentorship program, traveling not as a pilot, but as a passenger with no particular destination in mind. He's growing a beard, which Benjamin pretends to hate but which Ruth told me she thinks makes him look distinguished. He smiles more easily now, laughs more freely, and the desperate quality that used to haunt his eyes has softened into something that looks like peace and progress. He still struggles sometimes. There are still nights when Ruth sees him standing in front of his mirror, still moments when the weight of expectation and uncertainty threatens to overwhelm him. But the difference now is that he's not alone in those moments. He knows his mother is watching not as a spy but as a companion. He knows his father loves him without condition. And he knows Sarah is just a phone call away, ready to listen without judgment or agenda. Ruth is different too. The anxiety that had been slowly consuming her has been replaced by a kind of purposeful energy. She started a new initiative through her foundation, a program that trains family members of deaf individuals in advanced ASL and provides counseling for families navigating communication barriers. She's asked Sarah to help develop the program, and Sarah has agreed, bringing her lived experience to complement Ruth's resources and connections. Benjamin surprised everyone by becoming one of the program's most vocal advocates. He's begun learning ASL himself, at 68 years old, with a schedule that would overwhelm most people half his age. He's dedicating an hour each evening to studying sign language. He's terrible at it, according to Ruth, all thumbs and confusion. But he shows up every evening with determination and humility that I've rarely seen him display. "I've spent 38 years married to a deaf woman," he told me once, "and I've relied on her ability to adapt to my world rather than adapting to hers. That was laziness and arrogance on my part. Better late than never to correct it." And Sarah, she continues her work at the Copper Spoon, continues her modest life, continues showing up for the Goldstein family not as an employee or consultant, but as a genuine friend. She's teaching David to cook, which has become a kind of therapy for him. The meditative precision of chopping vegetables, the creative improvisation of seasoning and tasting, the honest satisfaction of creating something nourishing with his own hands. She's helped Ruth develop recipes for the Deaf School fundraising cookbook, translating complicated culinary techniques into clear visual instructions. She's even cooked dinner for Benjamin a few times, and though he'd never admit it publicly, I've seen him request her butternut squash soup specifically when he's had particularly difficult days. The dinner party last week, the Goldsteins hosted another dinner party, Smaller than the one 8 months ago, more intimate, with a different purpose. They invited a dozen people, but these weren't business associates or social climbers. These were people who'd been part of their transformation. David's therapist, several friends from Ruth's foundation, the director of the deaf school where Ruth volunteers, a few of David's new friends from his painting classes, and Sarah, of course, with her brother as her +1. Sarah cooked, but this time she wasn't hidden away in the kitchen as the hired help. She was introduced as a cherished friend of the family, and she moved between the kitchen and the dining room with ease, accepting compliments on her food with genuine humility and obvious pleasure. I watched David throughout the evening, and what struck me was how present he seemed. Not performing, not calculating, just existing fully in each moment. He laughed at his own terrible jokes, asked thoughtful questions of the other guests, and spoke about his journey with an honesty that would have been unthinkable 8 months earlier. At one point during dinner, Benjamin stood up with his wine glass, tapping it gently to get everyone's attention. Ruth sat beside him, and I noticed how he positioned himself so she could easily read his lips. "I want to propose a toast," Benjamin said, his voice carrying that authoritative tone he'd perfected over decades of board meetings and negotiations. 8 months ago, I thought I understood what success looked like. I'd built a company worth hundreds of millions, acquired properties around the world, achieved every professional goal I'd set for myself. He paused, and something in his expression softened. But I was missing the most important thing. I was missing my son, not physically but truly. I was missing my wife's perspective, valuing her adaptation to my world over my engagement with hers. I was missing the forest for the trees, as they say. He looked at Sarah, who was listening with her characteristic quiet attention. And then a young cook from Greenwich Village walked into our home and reminded us what actually matters. Not through lectures or interventions, but simply by showing up with empathy and wisdom and a willingness to bridge gaps the rest of us couldn't even see. He raised his glass. "So I'm toasting Sarah Mitchell, who taught us that the most valuable form of wealth isn't measured in dollars or properties, but in authentic connection, honest communication, and the courage to be vulnerable. Thank you, Sarah, for helping us find our way back to each other." Everyone raised their glasses, and Sarah's face flushed with embarrassment and pleasure. She signed something quickly to Ruth, who laughed and signed back, and I saw David lean over to whisper the translation to his father. "She says she's just grateful to be part of our family's story, and that we did all the hard work ourselves." She just held up a mirror. The evening continued with laughter and conversation, stories shared and connections deepened. Sarah's brother, whose name was James, told hilarious stories about their childhood misadventures, signing animatedly while Sarah translated for the hearing guests, and Ruth translated back into ASL for emphasis and comic effect. Later, I found Sarah in the kitchen washing dishes despite my protests that I would handle the cleanup. "It helps me think," she explained with a smile. "And besides, I'm more comfortable with my hands in dishwater than making small talk with millionaires." "You've changed their lives," I said simply. "You know that, don't you?" Sarah shook her head. "I didn't change anything, Marcus. I just saw what was already there. A family that loved each other but had forgotten how to show it. A mother desperately trying to reach her son. A son desperately trying to find himself. A father who'd prioritized the wrong things. They did all the changing themselves. I just happened to know sign language and show up at the right time." "Sometimes," I replied. "That's exactly what miracles look like. The right person with the right skills showing up at exactly the right time. Don't diminish what you've done here." She was quiet for a moment, then said something that I think captures the essence of this entire story. "We're all capable of saving each other, Marcus. We just have to be willing to see each other's pain, honor each other's struggles, and show up consistently with compassion. That's not special. That's just being human in the fullest sense of the word." Reflection. As I finish writing this account, I find myself reflecting on what I've witnessed these past 8 months. I've learned that transformation doesn't always come from grand gestures or expensive interventions. Sometimes it comes from a shy cook who knows sign language, showing up consistently with empathy and wisdom. Sometimes it comes from a mother's desperate love, watching through a connecting door and refusing to look away from her son's pain. Sometimes it comes from a father's willingness to apologize and learn and adapt, even when it challenges everything he thought he knew about strength and success. I've learned that the gaps between us, between hearing and deaf, between rich and poor, between the performance we present and the truth we hide, aren't as wide as they seem. They just require the right bridge: compassion, patience, and the courage to be vulnerable. I've learned that families are both more fragile and more resilient than I'd imagined. They can fracture under the weight of unspoken pain and unrealistic expectations, but they can also heal when someone, anyone, creates space for truth and models unconditional acceptance. Most importantly, I've learned that everyone is struggling with something, even especially those who seem to have everything. David Goldstein had wealth, looks, education, talent, and opportunity. Everything society tells us leads to happiness. But none of it mattered when he didn't know who he was beneath the performance, when he couldn't recognize himself in the mirror, when he was drowning in expectations that had nothing to do with his authentic desires and values. Sarah saw that. She saw past the privilege to the pain underneath. She saw past the performance to the person beneath. And in seeing him, really seeing him, without judgment or agenda, she helped him begin to see himself. That's what we all need ultimately: to be seen, to be understood, to be loved not for what we achieve or how well we perform, but simply for who we are, struggles and all. 1 year later, I'm adding this final section 1 year after Sarah first walked into the Goldstein mansion. David has decided to return to flying, but on different terms. He's joined a humanitarian aviation organization that provides emergency medical transport and disaster relief flights. He says it gives him the freedom of the sky he always loved, but now in service of something that feels meaningful rather than just luxurious. He's still painting, still exploring, still figuring himself out, but he's doing it with less desperation and more curiosity. Ruth's communication program has expanded to 3 cities, helping hundreds of families bridge the gaps between deaf and hearing family members. She and Sarah co-wrote a guide called Listening with Your Eyes, a practical approach to family communication, which has become surprisingly popular beyond just deaf community contexts. Benjamin sold his company 6 months ago, not because it was failing, but because he decided he'd rather spend his remaining years on things that matter more than quarterly earnings. He's now dedicating his time and resources to affordable housing initiatives and educational programs for immigrant communities. Making money is easy, he told me. Making a difference is hard. I'd like to try hard for a change. And Sarah, she's still at the Copper Spoon, still living modestly in Greenwich Village, still showing up for the Goldstein family when they need her. She started dating James's best friend, a deaf artist named Michael, and Ruth has already started hinting about future grandchildren, which makes Sarah laugh and blush in equal measure. The other day, I asked Ruth if she ever imagined, when Sarah first walked into her kitchen, that this shy young cook would become such an integral part of their family's transformation. She signed back with a smile. I knew immediately, not the details, but the essence. I saw someone who'd been broken and healed, who'd suffered and learned, who'd been humbled by life in ways that made her wise beyond her years. I saw someone who could see me, really see me, not as a wealthy deaf woman, but as a mother in pain, and I knew somehow that she'd been sent to help us find our way home to each other. Then she added something that I think perfectly summarizes this entire story. Sometimes angels don't come with wings and halos. Sometimes they come with flour-dusted aprons and calloused hands, and the ability to bridge the spaces between us that we didn't even know existed. I couldn't have said it better myself. This is a true story, though some details have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved. The Goldstein family, not their real name, gave me permission to share their story with the hope that it might help other families who are struggling with similar issues. The weight of expectations, the performance of normalcy, the isolation that comes from being unable to communicate our deepest truths. If you're reading this and you recognize yourself in any of these characters, whether you're the person struggling in secret, the family member watching helplessly, or the potential bridge between worlds, please know this: transformation is possible, healing is available, understanding is within reach, but it requires courage. The courage to be honest about your struggles, to ask for help, to sit with discomfort, to release expectations, to love unconditionally, to show up consistently, even when you don't have answers. It requires vulnerability, the willingness to let others see you as you actually are rather than as you think you should be, to admit when you're lost, to acknowledge when you need guidance. And it requires compassion for yourself, for your family members, for everyone trying to navigate this complicated business of being human. Sarah's wisdom wasn't complex or revolutionary. It was simply this: see people. Really see them. Honor their struggles. Hold space for their pain. Show up consistently with empathy. Love without condition. And trust that sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything. Thank you for reading this story. If it touched you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. We're all walking each other home. Let's do it with as much compassion as we can carry.